Shackled by Yesterday. My Father, a Prisoner of His Past. Audiobook Introduction. The past has a way of holding on to us, sometimes as a quiet whisper, sometimes as an unshakable burden. For my father, it was the latter. His life was a testament to the power of history, to the wounds that refused to heal, and to the invisible chains that bound him to memories he could never escape. This book is not just his story. It is a reflection on how the past shapes us, molds us, and sometimes imprisons us. It is about the demons we inherit, the choices we make, and the battle between redemption and regret. My father was a man of strength, yet he was haunted by the echoes of his youth, by the mistakes he could not undo, and by the weight of a life that had been marked by pain and unresolved wounds. I grew up watching him wrestle with his past, sometimes in silence, sometimes in outbursts of emotion that he could not control. He was a father, a husband, a provider, but he was also a man fighting battles that no one could see. Through his journey, I learned that while we cannot change where we come from, we can decide whether we let it define us or destroy us. This book is my attempt to understand the man my father was, the struggles he faced, and the prison of memory that he could never escape. It is a journey through pain, forgiveness, and the hope that even the most broken souls can find peace. May his story serve as a reminder that while the past may shape us, it does not have to confine us. Welcome to his story. I often wondered if my father realized how much his past controlled him. To the outside world, he was a man of quiet resilience, a hard worker, and someone who had built a life out of sheer determination. But behind closed doors, there were shadows, memories that clung to him, regrets that whispered in the silence, and pain that shaped the way he loved, the way he parented, and the way he saw himself. As a child, I didn't fully understand why he seemed distant at times, why certain words or moments triggered an unspoken sorrow in him. But as I grew older, I began to recognize the weight he carried. It wasn't just about what had happened in his life. It was about what he had never been able to let go of. He wasn't simply living, he was surviving, navigating a world where his past was always just a step behind him. I write this book not just as his child, but as someone who has spent years piecing together the puzzle of his life. I want to understand what held him captive, what wounds he carried so deeply that they became a part of him, and what it meant for me and those who loved him. This story is one of pain, but it is also one of love. It is about the way our histories shape us, the battles we fight in silence, and the ways in which trauma is passed down through generations. It is about the power of memory, how it can imprison us, but also how it can be confronted and, perhaps, healed. I do not write to judge my father. I write to understand him, to give voice to the struggles he never spoke of, to shed light on the burdens that many people carry but rarely acknowledge. And, in doing so, I hope to offer a path for others who find themselves trapped in the past, searching for a way forward. Because while the past may chain us, it does not have to define us. And while my father remained a prisoner of his past, perhaps his story can help someone else break free. This is his story, and in many ways it is mine too. Chapter 1. The Making of a Prisoner. Every man has a story, but not every man is free from his past. My father was a man whose life was shaped not just by the choices he made, but by the circumstances he was born into, the struggles he endured, and the silent wounds he carried. Before he became the man I knew, before he was a father, a husband, or a provider, he was a boy molded by hardship, a young man burdened by expectations, and eventually, a prisoner of memories he could never escape. This chapter is about the beginning, the roots of his pain, the scars that time never erased, and the events that placed him on a path where the past held him captive. Childhood scars and early hardships. The past leaves its marks in ways we don't always see. For my father, those marks ran deep, starting in the early years of his life. He grew up in a world where struggle was the norm, and love was often expressed through survival rather than affection. His childhood was one of sacrifices, one where dreams were luxuries and survival was the priority. As a child, he learned quickly that life was unforgiving. Poverty, hardship, and unmet needs forced him to grow up before his time. The people around him were tough, shaped by their struggles, passing down pain as if it were an inheritance. Perhaps the greatest lesson my father learned early on was that emotions were weaknesses, and weaknesses had no place in a world where every day there was a fight to make it to the next. He learned to swallow his pain, bottle up his feelings, and carry burdens without ever speaking of them. But just because something isn't spoken doesn't mean it disappears. Lessons learned in silence. Silence became my father's first prison. As a boy, he learned that speaking about his emotions wouldn't change anything. So, he stayed quiet. He absorbed everything. The disappointments, the pain, the loneliness, and carried them as if they were his alone to bear. He learned that crying was useless, that expressing pain would only invite ridicule, and that the best way to survive was to endure. This silence followed him into adulthood, shaping the way he approached life, relationships, and fatherhood. But silence does not mean the absence of emotion. It often hides the deepest wounds. The burden of unresolved pain. The unspoken hurts of childhood have a way of manifesting in adulthood, often in ways we don't even recognize. My father carried his childhood pain into his relationships, his work, and his fatherhood. He was a man who provided but struggled to express love. A man who wanted connection but built walls to protect himself. Many of his choices, his distance, his temper, his moments of withdrawal, were not just personality traits. They were symptoms of a deeper battle. He was still fighting old ghosts, still running from memories that never truly left. Perhaps the saddest part is that he never truly realized the prison he was in. He had long accepted his struggles as just part of who he was. But in reality, they were chains. Chains he never learned to break. And those chains didn't just bind him. They affected all of us who loved him. The making of a prisoner. Continued. Time does not always heal wounds. Sometimes it deepens them, burying them under layers of responsibility, expectation, and unspoken sorrow. My father was a man who learned to live with his past, rather than confront it. But the truth is, no one can truly escape their history. It lingers in the corners of the mind, shaping choices, relationships, and even self-worth. This chapter continues to unravel the story of how his struggles began, and how, long before he realized it, his past had already claimed him as its prisoner. The struggles that shaped him. Pain has a way of molding a person, and my father was no exception. His life was defined not only by hardship, but by the constant battle to be something more than what life had given him. He wanted to be strong, to rise above his circumstances, but every step forward was met with invisible chains pulling him back. 1. The weight of expectations. From an early age, my father was taught that a man's worth was measured by what he could provide. Love, emotion, and vulnerability were not currency in his world. Strength and resilience were. He grew up believing that failure was not an option, and that showing weakness would make him less of a man. This belief followed him into adulthood. He worked tirelessly, carrying the financial and emotional burdens of his family without complaint. But inside, the pressure was suffocating. No matter how much he provided, it never felt like enough. No matter how hard he tried, he always feared he would fall short. And when a man fears he will never be enough, he begins to withdraw. Not just from others, but from himself. 2. The silent battle between strength and vulnerability. There is a certain tragedy in watching someone fight a battle they do not even acknowledge. Chapter 2. The struggles that defined him. Struggles are like shadows. They follow us, shaping how we walk, how we see the world, and how we interact with those around us. My father's struggles were not just obstacles, they became a part of him, woven into his identity. He was a man who fought battles every day, some visible and others hidden beneath a hardened exterior. This chapter explores the struggles that defined him, the battles that consumed him, and the silent war he waged within himself. Some of these struggles were born from his past, others from the expectations placed upon him, but all of them shaped the man he became. Carrying the weight of expectations. From a young age, my father was conditioned to believe that a man's worth was measured by how much he could endure. In his world, pain was to be tolerated, burdens were to be carried without complaint, and emotions had no place in a man's life. A man doesn't cry. That was the lesson he learned early on. Crying was for the weak, and weakness was not an option. A man provides. No matter how exhausted, broken, or unfulfilled he felt, he had to keep going because responsibility was greater than personal happiness. A man doesn't ask for help. Admitting struggle was seen as a failure, a sign that he wasn't strong enough to handle life on his own. These lessons became his gospel, and he lived by them. But what happens when a man is too afraid to admit he is struggling? What happens when he believes asking for help is the same as surrendering? The answer is simple. He suffers in silence, and that silence becomes a prison of its own. The battle between strength and vulnerability. The world expected my father to be strong, but deep inside, he longed for connection. He wanted to be able to express himself, to be vulnerable, but the fear of appearing weak held him back. Instead of expressing pain, he masked it with work, burying himself in responsibilities to distract from his own emotions. Instead of showing love openly, he expressed it through sacrifice, believing that providing was the only way to show he cared. Instead of trusting others with his emotions, he chose isolation, retreating into himself rather than risking being misunderstood. This internal struggle left him trapped. He was strong for everyone else but weak within himself. He carried the weight of the world, but had no one to share it with. And the more he suppressed his emotions, the heavier the burden became. The weight of it all was suffocating. When the past controls the present. We often believe that we leave the past behind as we grow. But my father's past followed him into every stage of his life. In his work, he pushed himself harder than necessary, as if proving his worth would erase the feelings of inadequacy he had as a child. In his relationships, he struggled to let his guard down, always expecting disappointment or betrayal. In his fatherhood, he loved deeply, but from a distance, unsure how to express affection beyond provision and discipline. He was living in the present, but reacting to the past. Every struggle he faced in adulthood was an echo of something he had endured in his younger years. And the hardest part? He never realized it. The breaking point. When struggles become chains. There comes a point when struggles become more than just challenges. They become chains, holding us back from the life we were meant to live. For my father, his struggles didn't just affect him, they shaped the way he interacted with the world. He struggled with trust. Too many disappointments made him skeptical of others' intentions. He struggled with self-worth. No matter how much he achieved, it never felt like enough. He struggled with control, because the chaos of his past made him fear losing grip on his present. He didn't realize that in trying so hard to be strong, he was slowly breaking inside. The struggles that defined him. Continued. Struggles don't always come in the form of external battles. Sometimes the greatest wars are fought within, in silence where no one else can see. My father's struggles were not just about providing for his family, working hard, or enduring hardship. His deepest struggles were internal, emotional, psychological, and spiritual battles that shaped how he lived, how he loved, and how he saw himself. As I reflect on his life, I see now that many of his struggles were never about the present. They were shadows of a past that refused to leave him. They were wounds that had never healed, emotions that had never been addressed, and expectations that had been placed on him before he was even old enough to understand what they meant. The fear of being vulnerable. One of my father's greatest struggles was his inability to be vulnerable. He had been raised to believe that showing weakness was dangerous, that admitting pain would only invite more suffering, and that men were supposed to endure without complaint. And the higher that wall became, the lonelier he felt. The struggle with self-worth. No matter how much my father achieved, he never felt like he was enough. He could work tirelessly, provide for his family, and carry the weight of responsibility on his back. Yet deep inside there was always a voice whispering, "You're still not enough." This voice did not come from reality. It came from his past. It came from a childhood where love had to be earned, where mistakes were met with punishment rather than grace, and where he was made to feel that his worth was tied to what he could do, not who he was. As a result, he was hard on himself, never allowing himself to rest, always feeling the need to prove his worth. He was hard on others, expecting the same level of perfection that he demanded from himself. He was never satisfied, even in moments of success, because he believed there was always something more he needed to do. Please, like, share, and subscribe. Thank you for your support. All audiobooks are available on Amazon and Kindle. Don't forget to check out my author page on Amazon for new book releases.